First of all, it is very lovely to be here today. Everyone has treated me and my family very kindly, so it's an honor to be here talking to you today. I'm a little embarrassed to say, this is my first trip to Amsterdam, but better late than never, and I guess all it took was a little ongoing global political catastrophe to get me here, so small price to pay. I normally speak a little more freely, but since I can't do the courtesy of speaking your language, I will try to stick to my remarks a little bit more than normal in the hopes that I'll be as clear as possible. I have been asked to talk about democracy and the so-called crisis of liberalism. I say so-called, not because there isn't a crisis, but because, oh, thank you. I should have asked if you guys can hear me okay. I have a tendency to wander. I say so-called not because I don't think there's a crisis, but I have found that these terms, democracy and liberalism, to be almost pathologically conflated, and so it's never entirely clear to me what exactly is in crisis. I'm going to focus mostly on the American experience because that is what I know best, but I don't think your experience here is all that different. The weakening of traditional parties, the rise of populism, creeping authoritarianism, these are signs of a broader liberal democratic illness, and we are all experiencing them in our own ways. And because a lot of the forces shaping it are technological, it is a problem for democracies everywhere, more or less. A lot of us in this room are journalists, and what it means to be a journalist seems to be changing very quickly, or to be more precise, the reach of journalism, what it can and cannot do, is changing very quickly. And to be honest, I'm still not quite sure what the crisis of liberalism means for our profession. But we are in a period of transition. Of that, I am absolutely certain. And I'm trying to see things with clear eyes. And I suspect maybe by the end of this talk, you will let me know if I'm succeeding in that endeavor. So, let me try to clear up some of the confusion about democracy and liberalism to tee up what I'm going to say after that. And I apologize in advance if for a minute I sound a little bit like a wonky political scientist type, but just bear with me. Most people think of democracy in institutional terms, right? Elections, constitutions, parliaments. That's not wrong, of course. Those are all very important features of democracies. But democracy is much more than a web of institutions. I have come to think of it as a particular kind of culture, a culture rooted in free expression and its consequences. And indeed, those consequences are very messy, as it turns out. Democracy is not merely how we choose our leaders. It is how we talk to each other. It is how we form our beliefs about the world. It is how we persuade each other. And because it is open and free, it is inherently unstable. Anyone can speak, anyone can persuade, anyone can be persuaded of anything. The unfortunate truth is that there is nothing inexorably liberal about democracy, because many other forms of political life, many other forms of government can emerge out of democratic societies, like fascism, for instance, like a populist, a liberal regime like Hungary today. Liberal democracy is terrific, but it is just one of the exits along the democratic highway. And unfortunately, all the other exits are considerably worse. I think most of us want democracy to be a battle of ideas and policies, rooted in facts and evidence-based discourse. But democracy is not that. It can be in its most ideal expression, but it is in fact rarely that. And the best hack we have created, as far as I can tell, to avoid the worst democratic outcomes is liberalism. Liberalism is about restraint, legal institutions, protecting rights, imposing limits on power, especially state power. When you think about all the guardrails that protect democracy from itself, that is liberalism. And these guardrails are failing us right now. They're failing in my country, to be sure. I think they're failing here. I think they're failing all over the world. So why is that? What is happening? Why is the liberal order, such as it is, cracking? To be sure, there are lots of reasons. I want to be very clear about this near the front. This is not a monocausal story, right? I am not here to propose a grand theory of liberalism's decline. There is a story here about global capitalism. There's a story about the failure of elites. There's a story about immigration and dislocation and social welfare and the privatization of public life and many other things. And there are many other people more equipped to tell that story, and I hope they continue to do so. I have decided to focus on the technological story, the story about our information environment, because I think it remains under-theorized. And so here in capsule form is that story. For much of the 20th century, democracies were held together by a centralized media environment. A few trusted outlets set the agenda. Gatekeepers, as they're called, filtered the discourse. And while that system had serious blind spots, and I'll say more on that later, it also created something like a shared reality. People were watching the same movie we call reality. But that world is dead, and it is not coming back. That old system worked in part because there was a crucial distribution monopoly on information. The gatekeepers never controlled the public conversation, but they did effectively draw a circle around permissible thought. At the very least, they imposed boundaries on the discourse. But decentralized computing and publishing has ended that arrangement and the forms of authority and trust on which it relied. That is the crisis. And this collapse hasn't just affected journalism, it has destabilized almost everything: politics, institutions, culture. Because when you lose control of the information environment, you lose the ability to coordinate meaning. It becomes very difficult for a society to tell itself a coherent story about itself. And without a coherent story, cooperation at scale is incredibly difficult. The Netherlands, as you all well know, is not immune to this. I know that trust in American media has absolutely plummeted in the last 10 to 20 years. I don't know what the numbers are now, but it's, I think, media and Congress pull in the single digits when it comes to trust. I believe the situation here is comparatively better on this front, but it's still trending in the wrong direction. And trust in the press, generally speaking, seems to be dropping wherever you look. And naturally, populist parties are ascendant. And this is a familiar story throughout Europe, in France, in Germany, Italy, Hungary. The far right has gained ground. And there is, of course, let me take a sip of water before this. There is, of course, the case of Donald Trump. Whose name I hate to even mention, in part because a truly obscene amount of ink and oxygen has already been spilled trying to explain this man, including by yours truly. I bring Trump up only because his political existence is very much a symptom of the breakdown I'm talking about. I don't think it's too much to say that the digital world made Trump possible, because the internet, social media in particular, is an exquisite engine for manufacturing distrust and confusion and anger, and Trump is a creature of all three. This isn't just a story about the US and Europe. Again, as I'm sure people in this room know, in India and Brazil, the Philippines, I could go on, in places where liberal institutions were already fragile, the destabilizing effects of the digital age are even more apparent. Deciding how to respond to these challenges is very hard. But certainly the beginning of that process is asking, what would a healthy, sustainable communication culture look like in the 21st century? What is the alternative in a media environment like this one? I get this question a lot, and I still don't think I have a very good answer, but I found it is easier to say what it isn't, as a way of trying to explain what it might actually be. A healthy democratic culture is not one in which there is some widespread consensus. Either a society is free and open, or it isn't. And if it is, there will be lies and sophistry, there will be firebrands and provocateurs and bullshit artists and political arsonists. This is all baked into the democratic cake. And there will never be, nor should there be, an agreement on those foundational questions about what the good life is, or what fairness means, or who deserves what, and how. We just need structures in place to facilitate the disagreements. And we need a majority of the populations to believe in the legitimacy of those institutions. We need liberalism, in other words. So my point is never to suggest that liberal democracy demands harmony. What it does require is some baseline of social trust and a mutual commitment to the liberal democratic game. Because democracy really is an iterative game that runs on the goodwill of its players. One of the clearest lessons of the Trump era for Americans is that the most important self-preserving features of liberal democracy are not our laws, not our institutions, not even our Constitution. It is the norms and values and practices that allow the game to continue without violence, which is all that's left when conversation fails. And again, I don't really know how to make that game work reliably in a world where everything, including the truth, is up for grabs. And it is up for grabs. Can I say shit? I already said that. Is it okay? All right. The zone, to borrow a phrase from that toad, Steve Bannon, who you might have heard of, the zone is hopelessly flooded with shit. There is so much information, so much misinformation, so many stories, so many diversions, so much entertainment, so many spectacles. The press cannot keep up. The experience of my first year in journalism was the year Trump was elected. And spending the next 4 years, now I'm going off the script, which I said I wasn't going to do. My first 4 years watching my colleagues chase around every insane thing he said, like greyhounds running around a track, was maddening. But that was the game. Bannon also occasionally uses the phrase muzzle velocity to describe this. It's colorful, right? To describe the same thing. You flood the zone by multiplying the narratives, and you do it at a relentless pace. And the point isn't to persuade, so much as to confuse and muddy the waters. And that produces a kind of nihilism in which people are so skeptical about the possibility of finding the truth that they give up the search altogether. I have seen this painfully in my own country. And I want to be super clear about this. This is the soil out of which fascism and illiberalism springs. Because if you don't have facts, you don't have accountability. And if you don't have accountability, you don't have the rule of law. And if you don't have the rule of law, you don't have liberal democracy. This is why my friend, the historian Tim Snyder, likes to say that post-truth is pre-fascism. I think he's right about that. A lot of people called him apoplectic and hysterical when he was sort of sounding the alarm about what was coming. I think he's looking better and better. Now, I do want to pause and state very clearly that none of this is to say that this old media system was perfect. It wasn't. It was often elitist, exclusionary. Certainly in America, we were complicit in colossal injustices. Certainly the Iraq War comes to mind. The loss of public trust was, in so many ways, earned. And again, I'm speaking directly to the American experience. I don't want to imply that this is equally true here or anywhere else, though I suspect there is at least some overlap. The point, in any event, is that there are no gatekeeping institutions anymore. Well, there are still gatekeeping institutions, but they do not have nearly the power that they once did. Information will never be controlled again. So this next phase of democracy, whatever it is not about managing the flow of information. It is about helping people learn to live with its abundance. And this leads to an obvious question for people like us in this room. Where does this leave journalism? What is our role? What is our task? The honest truth is, I don't know if journalism can do what we need it to do, what it ought to do in the digital age. I really don't know. I'm hoping to go home convinced that I'm wrong about that. Journalists are now travelers like everyone else in this splintered, saturated info space. And those classic journalistic tools, fact-checking, reporting, are ill-equipped for the volume and velocity of the digital age. I always thought that the real power of journalism was its ability to set the agenda, to dictate salience, to tell the public not necessarily what to think, but what's worth thinking about, what's worth paying attention to, right? Here's what matters. Here are the facts. This is what happened. The digital earthquake hasn't entirely destroyed our capacity to do that, but it has eroded it considerably. Considerably. Most of the people who still consume legacy media, people who read the New York Times or The Economist, are part of the political class. These are hyper-educated elites. The rest of the country is largely tuning them out, which of course undermines one of the most important functions of the press, which is to check power. But you cannot do that if the only people you're reaching are the people who make up the power structure. And as I'm sure others will point out today, because I get this a lot, it's not as though liberal democracy cannot exist without the 20th century gatekeeping media ecosystem. We know that because liberal democracy preceded that. Which is why I'm very careful never to say that liberal democracy is dead. My point is that the model of liberal democracy we lived under for more than half a century has collapsed. And we are in a very bumpy process of adaptation. You're probably wondering, when is this guy going to get to the good news? I'm working on it. How am I doing on time? Okay. Okay. I'll try to, they told me 20 minutes. I'll try. Anyway, that's fair. This is the part of the speech where the speaker very graciously points the way out of the darkness. You know, I've carefully considered our problems, and I have prepared a 70-point bullet plan to get us out of it. I cannot do that, unfortunately. But I do think there are things that we can and should do, and I'll share a little bit of that with you today, if you don't mind. I do think that we can fight for spaces that still make meaningful dialogue possible local newspapers. The death of local newspapers and local media in America has been catastrophic. Catastrophic. It has nationalized politics in a way that has reduced it to pure narrative. There's just team red, team blue, no nuance, very disconnected from actual lived life. Again, the American experience is a little unique here, but telling. Newspapers, public broadcasters, civic forums, I mean, these are not just quaint leftovers from a pre-digital world. I think they are and always will be vital arteries of democratic life. Will they matter as much as they once did? Probably not, because the world has changed. But they still matter, and we have to act as though that's the case. Sorry. We can also design better systems. We can push for platforms that reward depth over virality. We can demand transparency in how our digital environments are shaped. The internet doesn't have to be optimized for engagement and advertising. And this came up at the dinner we did last night, the role for regulation here, potentially. It is entirely possible that there is a role for regulation here to change the rules in which these platforms operate. This is probably a place where Europe will have to lead the way, because I don't see any appetite for this in America. But even as we try, and here we go, I'm going back to the bad news. Even as we try to do these things, there is, I have to say, much more disruption ahead. And I think it will be much more intense than what we've already experienced. I've spent a lot of time thinking about artificial intelligence. I've had a lot of people on my show who understand AI much better than I do. And the more people I talk to, the more convinced I am that we are not prepared at any level for what's coming. It will be, in some ways it already is, an event horizon for our societies. And nobody knows what the political implications will be. But they will be immense. I'm sure of that. If we think Twitter, or X, or whatever the hell we're calling it these days, is the most spectacular engine of misinformation in human history, what will social media look like in a world in which AI is producing oceans of content, text, images, videos that are indistinguishable from reality? What possible hope do we have of separating truth from falsehood when that tsunami hits? What will that distinction even mean in that world? I don't know. One thing I've come to believe doing journalism in America is that people love the truth, but my God, they hate facts. Love the truth. Everybody loves the truth. They hate facts. Because facts are about what is, and truth is about feeling. People believe what they believe because of how it makes them feel, about themselves, about the world. Truth in that sense is a story. And the world of AI will be a world in which our feeds are optimized to reinforce our preferred stories. And I don't think it'll be the stories we actually want. It will be the stories we think we want. It'll be the stories we are trained to want. And right now, already, with every click, with every like, with every share, with every purchase, we are telling the machines and the people who own them how we want to feel. And they are getting better at making us feel it. And if any technology can dictate our feelings, then it can also dictate the truth. And if it can do it at the individual level, then on a long enough timeline, it can also do it at the level of societies and civilizations. Which is why I think it is completely insane that we are unleashing these tools into the world without knowing what will happen or how we'll manage it. But this is the way technology has always gone. We build the thing, we hope it works, and we figure it out on the other side. One of my favorite jokes from Jon Stewart was the last words a human being will ever utter will be somebody in a lab coat going, "It worked!" feels like that. Because everyone knows, including the people who are building these technologies, and I talk to them all the time, they know that the consequences will be enormous and potentially catastrophic. But this is happening, whether they want it to or not, whether I want it to or not, or whether you want it to or not. The winds of change are blowing. And again, there are still various other crises to contend with, crises of capitalism and climate change in particular. The fact that avenues to meaningful participation in public life are disappearing, that politics, in large part because of technology, is becoming more and more disconnected from lived experience, less and less rooted in place, in physical communities. This is not good for democracy, and I don't think it's good for us as human beings. And the reality is that the more hollow and virtual our lives become, the less connected we feel to other people, the more vulnerable we are to reactionary political movements that feed on the resentment and the loneliness that these conditions create. This is very much the doom loop I feel like I'm living in my own country. I've said a lot. I want to end with this. This is the good news, sort of. Not really. I have spent this entire little speech talking about why democracy is difficult, why I think it's going to get more difficult. But to say that it is difficult is not to say that it's impossible. One impression I don't want to leave in anyone's mind here today is that I think all of this is just a matter of personal virtue or media literacy. Democracy is a collective project. It only works if people organize, build coalitions, if they act together in public, not just online, but in the world. If democracy is going to survive these disruptions, it won't be because individuals just learned how to curate their information diet, although you should definitely do that. It'll be because people found ways to act together, to communicate and confront unjust power together. In the end, that is really all we can do. Democracy is to be admired because it makes that possible. And while I think it is obvious enough that democracy will very rarely, if ever, produce the ideal outcome, I still think it is the best chance we have to avoid the worst. But it is an existential project. The end of my book ends with a paean to Sisyphus rolling up the boulder. I think it's a metaphor for democracy in a lot of ways. Democracy is never secure or finished because it is unfinishable. It has to be continually re-achieved, here, there, anywhere. Being a democratic citizen, if it means anything, means taking responsibility for this situation and affirming the values we know to be fair and good, regardless of the outcome. And the hope is that by refusing to give up on those values, by insisting on them, we might just keep them alive a little bit longer. And if we can't, then there is at least dignity in the struggle. Thank you for listening.